All right, Chris, thank you so much for joining us for our now third Rival Jam. We're going to be talking about your experience and advice on how to build an always-on culture of innovation. Before we get into it, as you know, since it's a lot cheaper to run a virtual event, we're not paying for everybody's dinner here. Instead, we're going to try to do a little bit of good and donate for everybody who joins to a charity of your choosing. So why don't you first tell us who we're going to be donating to today?
Pipelines. So Pipelines is a company started by the founder of Pretty Bird Productions. And Pipelines is designed to give, youth of color opportunities in the creative, technology, and entertainment industries. It's sort of like a matchmaker, like the app kind of feels like Tinder. It was, so you're matchmaking with Gen Z and young millennials who are already on their professional journey. And they so far have operations in New York, LA, and London. And so I've been at it for about a year and a half. The board is pretty crazy. It's got people like Pharrell is on the board, Baron Davis. I kind of served as their innovator in residence at the beginning when they were just kind of starting, like figuring out like how they were going to grow. It's been pretty great. So they're going to get my $50. And I'll get nothing. No, I'm just kidding. I'll get a warm heart.
Great. Well, send over the link, and we'll make that donation on behalf of everyone here. Cool. So obviously, the folks here know a little bit about you, but for the folks that are going to be listening to this after the fact, can you give a quick introduction on who Chris Denson is, what he's all about, and then we'll get into the meat of the conversation.
Usually I'm on the other side of these conversations, which is, I guess that's a perfect entry point. Sometimes I say I get to be the Anthony Bourdain of innovation, which, there's a downside to that. So I'll leave the downside out of it. But for the most part, I live this hybrid existence as a multimedia host and storyteller in the innovation space, particularly. And I've been doing that for about 7 years. I've worked with Fast Company and Cannes Lions. I've had my own platform. I've worked with the Emmys, and just kind of like, how do we curate the best storytelling around ingenuity, creativity? Who's doing it? What's the psychology of it? Less of what is it? So it's not like, oh, we're going to talk about virtual reality today or Web3. We may have somebody who happens to be in that space who is just, sort of awesome in their own right. And then, the other half of it, the reason I use the Bourdain metaphor is that, for the time that he was live, obviously he was still doing the craft in the kitchen, and still doing the thing that got him there. And obviously a lot of his conversations were curated around culinary experiences and the pipelines and so on and so forth. And for me, it's just working with a lot of brands and startups and government agencies. I have experience, I used to run the innovation practice for OMD for about 4.5 years, working with a ton of like amazing clients, ranging from CBS to Disney to Apple and Pepsi and and those sorts of brands, and even work with the Obama administration and the Global Entrepreneurship Summit as both an advisor to the startup ecosystem and a storyteller, interviewing folks like Daniel Lubetzky and Gene Case and these people who were part of the presidential ambassadors for global entrepreneurship. So it's a PAGE program. I used to joke and say they were like the Avengers of entrepreneurship. They would just get sent all over the world to do stuff. Sometimes one of them, sometimes all 5 of them. It was a pretty cool operation. And then currently doing some work with MullenLowe, and which we kind of share some career path there. And they haven't had an innovation practice in the 50 years that they've been around. And so just kind of helping ingrain that into the culture there in whatever ways and by any means necessary.
So why don't we start there? How do you do that? How do you ingrain innovation within an organization, particularly one that's at scale? How do you approach that?
With lots of tears. And it's never easy, right? Like I think especially if you're going into an inherited culture, right? You have to be nimble and flexible and not rigid. That I feel like the craft of innovation is there is no cookie cutter solution, right? It's always exploratory, always having a listening ear for what people are experiencing, how they think they want to get there, what they even think innovation is, because it's such a ubiquitous word depending on which department of which company you're in, right? So how do you do sort of a a homogenous, innovation culture. And it really starts, at least in this case, with listening. I did a huge listening exercise at the beginning of my time there and sat down with about 20 people in different positions and roles in the company and just asked a lot of nosy questions. Some of them were emotionally intelligent and some of them were a little bit more tactics. Some of them were like, what are your favorite moments? What do you think the hurdles are? And then you start to see like some entry points, some common threads in terms of what people's experiences are. And you get to understand the culture a little bit more. And especially if you're in the services business, right? Because whatever you want to do may not always match what the client wants to do. And so, there's that additional layer of, consideration. So, and then how do we present that as one voice to our client base? And how do we show up in the world as like there's a shift in the tone or the energy around how this agency is showing up as innovative? And it's a big task, but it's fun. And, I think also coming into it as a one-man show, where comparatively at OMD, I had a team of 20 people, right, all spread around the country. So that requires a different operating system around myself.
So we had our kind of in-person version of this, like the dinner series that we do in Dubai on Tuesday night, as I was saying to a couple of people before we press record. And one of the people who was there, he was brought in to two of the biggest telcos in the region. So first the one in the UAE and then the biggest one in Saudi, to basically start or help start their challenger brands internally. So actually kind of inject innovation directly into these organizations. And what he was saying, which I'm sure you hear all the time, you even mentioned it, is it really all comes down to culture. And because I think everybody says that, he's like, it is actually impossible to have a culture of innovation exist within a culture of kind of legacy. And I'm just curious to get your thought. He was like, you basically need to spin it out entirely, or it can be part of the same thing, but it needs to actually be separate, because the teams that are responsible for changing the business are never going to fit culturally with the teams that are responsible for running the business as it is right now. Mm-hmm. I'd just be curious to hear the reaction to that, or hear how you want to build on that, and like the culture piece specifically.
Yeah. No, I think it's sort of bookended, right? Like one part, I think the person who is hired, or whatever the operation is, has to realize that it's probably going to be a slow drip, right? It's not going to be some overnight change. And like, excuse me, I did a whole 30-page innovation framework, and like, here's how we should approach it. Here's what we've learned, blah, blah, blah. And the adaptation rate is relatively slow, which is, I kind of imagined it would be, right? Because you also, especially in this case, or even in your friend's case, it's like you're inheriting a company that's already a high performance kind of culture. So, they'd already done innovative work. It's just like, how do you continue that like a little bit more at scale if you want? And the reason I started with the bookend piece of it is I think leadership has to play a role in, using the resource, because it's almost like it can be an afterthought, at worst, I'll get a call at the 9th hour on something that's due a day from now or 2 days from now. And you're like, hey, we need to think about this from this angle. And where really you want to be there from the initial conversation of whatever the problem is that's being solved. And so, and I think there's an element of trust that has to be. And that's why that slow drip piece kind of becomes really important, as far as like, recognizing that your job is not going to be easy and it's not going to be some magical sprinkle dust that happens. And like, everybody's like, oh yeah, come, please help us. Which you get that, like that does happen. And then, but then there's a month later, people are back on their, normal day to day, and their calendars are full, and it's the last thing you're thinking about. So, but that element of trust is more like, all right, let's get in and get a win. That's any like principle of a new person or a new operation or a new effort at any company, is like, if we just show up and get as many incremental wins, when the big thing becomes the opportunity, there's a little bit more trust. People are on board. They're a little bit more giving of their time and their energy to jump on board with that because they've seen what has been possible in a smaller scale. So yeah, I look at it from those two angles initially.
Do you have any specific frameworks that you recommend or bring to the table when you're thinking about innovation, either internally within MullenLowe or all the content that you do, all these companies that you see trying this, some succeeding, some failing? I'm thinking of things like the 70-20-10 framework of how you allocate budget and resource, 70% going to kind of existing core business, 20% to what's kind of new, and then 10% to those moonshot type of ideas, and making sure that you're investing time and money in those big ideas that are high risk, but also high reward. Or, when I was CMO at 11FS, we talked about 1% improvement and 10% ideas. 1% improvements and 10x ideas. So much of what you end up doing is kind of the day-to-day looking for those little improvements, or even just like the maintenance of how things are right now. You need to kind of take a step back and sometimes just think blue ocean about what is a big thing that we can do. So we had a KPI in our team of we need to do 10x thing, even if it fails once a month. So are there any specific frameworks like that you think about or recommend?
No, honestly, hey, Eric, in my book, 10 Essential Rules for Breaking Essential Rules, there is 2018 probably available on Amazon. I kind of broke out these 10 principles I've learned, right? And I think they're all applicable individually or together or in small batches, depending on the environment you're innovating in, right? Like a startup probably has a little bit more of an appetite for outside of the box thinking, you talk challenger brands, you're entering a category or you're challenging, you're Under Armour and you're challenging Nike. Like you have a really good prompt to make innovation part of your culture. And then, yes, structure it in those different ways you talked about, right? Are we allocating budget? Do we have a maker space? Like what is that cadence of strategy? I think not more importantly, but just in what I've experienced kind of entering a lot of environments is kind of just keeping an always on communication of discovery, education, and inspiration. Whether that's a monthly presentation series with a collaborator. We're in the middle of doing that right now. I've brought in TikTok, Reddit, Sony strategic partnerships, and a couple of, high growth startups to say hey, here's what we do, but also here's what's around the corner that could be some really unique things. And also we're going to make this as easy for you to adopt and come on board with us as possible in partnership and in collaboration. And I think you do that enough times, right? I think just full transparency, when we did the TikTok session, it's probably 120 people that attended that. And I'm aware of about 4 people that reached out to TikTok and 2 that reached out to me. So, that is a low percentage of conversion, relatively speaking, but it begins that trickle and that's just one moment. So if I can do that with trends from South by Southwest or CES or, these other moments where startups and technology and analog culture is kind of evolving. And I can say, hey, here's what's kind of what we should be thinking about as an organization. And then, my favorite space is like the whiteboard, right? If you're in a brainstorm room, I can be the voice of how these things can apply to whatever problem a client is trying to solve. And finding those mutually beneficial inroads that might make sense. But to your original question, I think for me, it's more like, yes, there are different methodologies that can be employed. I mean, I think that if you're entering a culture, you have to stop, take a look back and listen, and then be prescriptive as to that particular culture. Rather than saying all right, everybody has to do 70-20-10, right? It's not everybody set up to do that.
Yeah. Cool. I think last question before we turn off the camera and open it up to the group conversation with the folks that are here. So if you had to kind of pick one thing in your experience, what everything that you see across the industry, one thing that you think is very manageable for people to actually start doing differently right now, if they're looking to drive more innovation within their existing business, what would that one thing be?
One is hard. The one that comes to mind is kind of like just open brainstorms. I love, I used to work for a company called Machinima, RIP. But for a while, I would do these things just called Thunder Thursdays. And we would go outside for 90 minutes, every other Thursday. And I was like, just come with an idea about anything. It could be about shoestrings or, food service trucks or something endemic to the gaming and fanboy cultural space. And I would say, I'm guesstimating a number, but a good percentage of those ideas and thoughts or conversations led to real solutions for the company. And so, I think emotionally, I guess, it's good to have an assignment that's not tied to your paycheck, right? Or a moment that's not tied to some immediate outcome where we all feel like the weight of a KPI, but to just go and say what if this, what if horses had 3 legs and we used the that's a terrible example, but it was about to get really dark and I was like, let me stop. But yeah, I think it's having that space to just breathe, especially in this virtual culture. I've been in so many meetings where, we're in the 3rd meeting about a specific problem. And I just stop and I go how's everybody feeling? And then you get this vomit of venting because nobody's been able to purge just the things that are going to be emotional blocks. I took acting lessons when the pandemic started, and it was a 3-hour class. And the first 45 minutes was just what were your wins and losses of the week? And and in that environment, it's not tied to work. It's just that's just life. So, and because in acting, in order to emote, whatever blockages you might have or be dealing with in the background can be, can hinder your performance. And I think the same principle applies to how we operate in business. You got to clear some things out of the way to be your best creative self. And the creativity doesn't just, apply to the creative departments, right? If you're in accounting and you want to find a different way to crunch the numbers and something that's more efficient, that requires some ingenuity and efficiencies and imagining. So, it's kind of freeing up that space to do so. So I think anyway, that open brainstorm is just one of those fun spaces to be in.
Cool. Chris, I'm going to stop the recording and we'll continue the conversation as a group, but thank you for joining again.
Yeah, cool. No, thank you.